Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stigma-Free Society's Facebook Live event. My name is Gerry Friesen, also known as a recovering farmer. I am a stress and conflict management specialist working out of Manitoba. Because of my own journey with mental illness, I have a real passion in talking about it because it is in talking to others we can find a path forward for ourselves. You can learn more about me by visiting gerryfriesen.ca. Through this Facebook Live event, I am representing the Stigma-Free Society, which is a Canadian registered charity that aims to reduce stigma of all kinds with a focus on mental health. This event is part of their Rural Mental Wellness Toolkit, an online community-based mental health program that creates access to mental health education and peer support training, as well as practical and relatable resources for those living in rural and agricultural communities. You can find the toolkit at ruralmentalwellness.com. I am excited today to have the opportunity to chat with William MacPherson. William, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Gerry. I'm excited to have an opportunity to talk to you today.
Well, you and I chatted for about 5 minutes before we started here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. But before we jump into some questions, I'm just going to give you folks a background on William. William is a mental health advocate, activist, and public speaker, sharing his lived experience with mental illness, as well as his healing journey to spark dialogue and inspire hope. William works at Salt Spring Island Community Services as a housing outreach worker and is a program coordinator for the Salt Spring Mental Wellness Initiative, where he works to develop community-led rural mental health solutions. William has completed the Stigma-Free Society's rural peer support training in partnership with Robyn Priest and sees great worth in peer-related programs. In his spare time, he loves to rap, sing, and make silly TikTok videos, and considers this side of his personalities to reflect his aim to be a professional silly man. I like that. Maybe we're going to have to get you to do some rapping before we're done.
If you would like, sure, I could do a few bars.
All right. Well, we'll jump in, William. Can you share with us a bit about your own personal journey with mental health and what inspired you to become a mental health advocate?
Well, I was always ill when I was a kid, and I was always different. I identified that I had deficits and didn't understand how to connect with my peers. In my 30s, I realized that I had what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, which is a kind of high-functioning autism. And I had the insight that all the mental illnesses I had accumulated as a teenager were actually built on this foundation of not understanding my own neurodivergence. But I was given Paxil at 15 years old, and that essentially made me bipolar. I was depression. I diagnosed depression and anxiety before that. And over the next 4 or 5 years, I accumulated a whole host of different diagnoses, personality disorders, mood disorders. It was all co-occurring with addiction. And I essentially believed that this was going to be my life. I couldn't function. I couldn't hold down a job. And then I did something which I would never suggest anybody else do. I did a bunch of research. That part's good. But then I went off all my medication because I realized I needed a baseline and that I'd never had a manic episode without taking an SSRI. And since then, I have been researching obsessively. Being obsessive is a gift that comes with my Asperger's, and really figured out why I had all these problems. And the why is complicated because it's a multivariable problem. But it's been amazing. And I always feel conflicted saying this. I don't feel mentally ill anymore. I feel very hypersensitive. It's not that I don't find life difficult, but the reason I put in my bio, I share my healing journey, is because I feel well.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we should always, it's so hard because if you aspire to that and everybody's telling you you can't have it or you don't find it, you might think you failed and you haven't. So much of dealing with mental illness is about coping. But in my case, you know, it made me who I am. And even though it was incredibly hard, I'm very grateful.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense to me, William, and I appreciate what you're saying. It's now been, I believe, about 20 years since I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression. And like you know, at the outset, you get thrown a bunch of medication and you go on the medication and really nothing is changing for you, although the medication may help. But by researching and by really being able to understand what's going on inside of us, is you know, it's rewarding because, like you say, you can find a path forward by doing that because you understand what's going on.
Yes, exactly.
So I would imagine, you know, through your own personal journey, you've met with a host of professionals who tried their best to help you.
I feel in some cases they tried their best. And I recognize my own bias in this. You know, when we're going through the system, it can feel dehumanizing. It can feel like we're reduced to our diagnoses. One of the things I share with clients who have mental health diagnoses is that these are cognitive maps. They're just clusters of symptoms. They're not objective truths. And so we want to use those cognitive maps to help you navigate the things that you're going through. But if they're not helping you navigate, it can be useful to put it down. You can always pick it back up and maybe try a different approach. That's one of the things I really enjoy about Robyn Priest's approach to mental health. So often I hear my clients feel just entirely reduced to their diagnosis and quite dehumanized. And I also think that while most mental health professionals are trying to do the best they can, they're working in a colonial system that seems to be generating an awful lot of mental illness. And so I think that in any kind of helping profession in our culture, we need to be really scrutinizing ourselves and the system we work in, to be looking at the inadvertent harm we may be causing.
Yeah, and along the lines of what you're talking about, and when you talk about navigating things, I can certainly relate to that. And I've often said that the professionals that helped me most were the ones that could connect dots for me. Not that they had an instant fix that day, but rather they were connecting dots for me, which again goes back to being able to understand what I'm dealing with, and by understanding that, being proactive about how to be able to live better.
Yes.
So, as a housing outreach worker and programs coordinator, William, what are some of the unique challenges and opportunities you've encountered while working in a rural community? And I guess perhaps before you answer that question, it talks about a rural community here. Do you perhaps talk a little bit about Salt Springs Island and exactly what kind of area you're working in?
So I would say Salt Spring is a rural community, although we haven't been zoned that way, which has been a challenge for us. We have weird governing bodies that don't just govern us. And so it makes it very hard to have self-governance and to be able to address issues as they arise proactively. I think one of the main challenges in any rural community is that we're under-resourced. You know, getting a psychiatrist, for instance, which is now basically necessary to get any kind of psychiatric drugs, you know, which while they can do harm, they also are really necessary tools in our toolbox. Another challenge is just being in a small community. You know, at our best, the interconnectivity can be leveraged into really a bigger community holding of mental health. And at its worst, things can be very divisive. There can be a lot of history which has baggage, and trying to get people into alignment, trying to find things where we can all agree and work towards. I think traditionally in my community, and I imagine in a lot of smaller communities, organizations are pretty siloed because they're under-resourced and essentially chasing fires, constantly trying to put out fires. It's hard for them to step back, get proactive, and build the relationships with people in other organizations that are necessary to really have a community holding.
Yeah, and what you say about rural communities and being able to have the resources available to the people you're working with, I think that's a common theme across Canada and rural communities, and it makes it, like you say, very, very difficult to be able to help the people in the best way you can.
Yeah.
So, to talk a little bit more about the Salt Spring Mental Wellness Initiative, and you know what it's all about.
So the first thing that set the initiative apart is that we brought in people who had lived experience as equal members. That's actually how I came in. I had a couple years of schooling, but it was my lived experience expertise that was why they wanted me to come in. And I think there a lot, because we understand the social justice issue of kind of nothing about us without us. I recognize that this is happening more, but I think in a lot of cases it's tokenism. You have your lived experience person in the room, and they're just kind of sitting there wondering what they're doing. But the initiative brought us in as equal partners, and really made us feel like the things we've been through were a form of expertise. Sometimes it's called context expertise versus content expertise, which is the clinical professionals and university educated people. We also recognized we didn't know how to do the thing we wanted to do. We wanted to do things differently, where we put our humanity and our authenticity first, and the roles that we were in, the hats that we were wearing second. And so it all started during the pandemic. So we had to figure out how to connect and create a cohesive kind of group dynamic while also meeting over Zoom, which was a challenge.
Yeah.
And then we did 6 online summits where we put a lot of energy into designing the agendas, and we brought in all kinds of amazing people with different backgrounds. And we organized that energy to try to tap into the group intelligence, right? Not a bunch of individuals trying to push their ideas, but kind of having this super organism that people can become when they work well together to help think what we could do. And I think we may have identified the best ideas that a rural community can realistically do, leveraging the people that are already in the community, which I think are our greatest resource. And so now we're at the point of trying to get funding to build out the programs that we have identified that we can do. And we're doing it in a way where if it does work, if we're able to get the funding and we're successful, we're documenting every step of our process so that other rural communities could replicate it as, more easily. And one of the things that set us apart is we created this thing we call the culture of care. So we created operating agreements on how we would come together, how we would navigate when people bump into each other. And we had feedback mechanisms every step of the way. I notice often in the professional world, there aren't a lot of healthy feedback mechanisms, right? And people aren't always the best at receiving feedback. And also, I think there's not a lot of talk about the responsibility we have in how we communicate to give feedback in a way that it can be received.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I saw in your bio when I was reading it, William, is you talk about the rural peer support training that you took, and I'm a staunch believer in peer support, but I'm curious how, when we talk about how peer support plays a significant role in your work, how do you see peer-related programs contributing to mental wellness, especially in rural areas?
So, the first thing that I found, I was a harm reduction peer support worker. It was so obvious that as soon as I told a client my own history, I just felt like this giant weight was lifted off their shoulders. And I think that weight comes from stigma. When they realized that I had been in addiction, that I had had many mental illnesses, that I'd been through my own version of what they were going through, it put them at ease. I think most of us with mental illness and addiction, we feel we stigmatize ourselves, and that stigma probably came from our culture, but we internalize it. And I found being in active addiction the shame was overwhelming. Often I was using so that I could cope with the shame I felt for where I was at. And so watching people kind of have that armor they're wearing kind of melt off them, and suddenly they're like, okay, let's talk. It was just so beautiful. I also, I value clinical professionals. I love working with them, but I love the saying, don't confuse the map with the territory. University education are cognitive maps, and people who have been in the depths of mental illness have lost themselves in addiction. This is the territory. And in my case, I'm very lucky, and this luck is built on privilege. I learned how to navigate that territory. I understand the journey from debilitating mental illness to wellness. And I think that if I was crossing Canada, I would want a map. But if it was by foot, I'd also want a guide who already knew the territory. And so I think that there are going to be, I imagine peer support as a modality growing, and I imagine there being more and more education around it that's designed for lived experience so that they can be more respected. I've noticed some people don't understand yet how important this modality is. And I think that we're going to need to get better at making the case to them. I know that's something Robyn Priest is really good at,
Yeah. Well, and like you say, that whole peer support thing, and certainly I recall when I started talking about my own story and my own personal journey, how people I would talk to, how people I would present to would come up to me after and start talking about their own journey, and these can be people I'd known, right, and never realized that they were on their own personal journey as well. But when you can start communicating that way with each other, when you can compare stories, I mean, we learn from each other, don't we? And like you say, it kind of releases the burden we've been carrying, because often it feels like we're alone in our journey and don't understand the fact that there's so many people out there that have their own experiences that can be helpful to us.
Yeah, I think it's so powerful when we tell our stories. And like, I was going to school for psychology, and I actually keep up on the DSM. I'm interested in all the clinical work, but what has been the biggest lever that I've been able to provide to help people make the changes they want, it's the person I became because of what I went through. And I find that being able to give very quality attention and being able to hold unconditional love for the people that I serve in a way that is boundary, but absolutely there, that feeling allows the other person to do the work that they need to do. And I wonder about the people who are mentally ill are often very sensitive. They're often very high in personality trait openness, very creative. And I wonder if we were in a more traditional tribal culture, whether some of these people might be our healers, they might be our shamans, they might be the people who are a bit outside of the cultural box of that tribe and are kind of bringing in these new ideas. When I gave my first talk at the Connection Project, I shared this anecdote about this West African shaman who was training to be a doctor in America, and he was visiting kind of insane asylums, that's what they were called then. And he said, "What have you done? You've locked up all your healers. What you call mental illness is spirit knocking on the door. And if that door isn't answered, spirit will just keep finding more people and knock on their doors." And I think it can be really useful to take off the cultural lens that we're wearing and put on other cultural lenses, because, there does seem to be some connection with how our culture is organized and mental illness, as we see this crisis just growing and more people having these challenges.
In your experience, William, what are some common misconceptions or stigmas associated with mental health in rural communities, and how do we address those?
I think the first challenge is because the community is small. There's a lot more pressure to keep it to yourself because information goes around. There's a thing people say on Salt Spring: if you haven't heard a good rumor by noon, make one up. And so I see youth at higher risk. I see a lot of adults who are housed but are very isolated at much higher risk. And I think it's really hard to protect people's anonymity. Confidentiality can be difficult to navigate as the constant dual roles that come up. And so all of these things add to the larger cultural stigmas to create a lot of barriers to getting help. When I shared my story, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was me recognizing all these challenges and recognizing that because of my many layers of privilege, it would be safer for me to share my story. And if people saw the value, hopefully it would be a bridge where other people could walk across and hear stories that, in a way, I think are more important. People who have more layers of stigma, challenges, and boundaries. If you don't have secure housing, that's a whole different layer of stigma. And also in Salt Spring, if you don't have any housing, you're probably going to hang out in town. And then all these people who are retirees, all these people who don't understand the many layers of challenges for people who are homeless. They're judging them. They're angry at them because they're being impacted. And so that makes it a very divisive issue. So even sometimes when we're trying to engage in dialogue in good faith, it can go way off the rails.
You've been doing this work for a while, William. I'm curious, do you see that stigma lessening out there? And I guess when I talk about stigma, I think there's two sides to that. First, of course, there's a person that's dealing with mental health issues or addictions, and then there's the other side is like you talk about the other side that doesn't have the experiences like that and are seeing it from outside that perspective.
Sorry, could you remind me what the first part of that question was?
Yeah, sorry, I get long-winded in my questions.
Oh,
I'm wondering if you've seen the level of stigma come down at all over the years that you've been working with this.
So yes and no. I think there's a cultural trend of stigma getting addressed and kind of unpacked and reduced. So in that way, I do think we're making progress. I certainly I got celebrated for sharing my story. No one was critical. It felt very safe. However, because I work with insecurely housed people, I've also seen the stigma get worse because due to macroscopic economic forces, especially during the pandemic, the issues of homelessness are expanding. Way more people are experiencing homelessness. And so we have more people wandering around our town, often using alcohol or drugs, often getting dysregulated. And because that impacts the people who live here, that also makes the challenges greater. And, I work with the RCMP and we talk about the challenge. Like they understand, they understand the complexity of what these people are going through who are on the streets here, but they also need to understand what the people who are impacted by it. And there aren't as many opportunities for dialogue as I would like. And so often these conversations get very polarized.
Yeah.
And it can be hard to invite people in. I'm really willing to sit down with people who feel quite strongly, what I might call prejudice or bias. I'm very happy to hold space for how they're impacted. But I need that dialogue to be in good faith where they might listen to why I think there's a better way to do this. Because I truly believe that if we don't input care, if we don't input support, if we don't make people feel like they're part of the community, we're going to not only perpetuate the problem, we're going to exacerbate it.
And you've kind of talked a little bit about my next question I have here for you, but maybe there's a little more you want to add to that. What strategies or initiatives have you found to be effective in encouraging open conversations about mental health in rural settings?
I think it's really good to have explicit agreements about how we're going to engage. So in the initiative, we created operating agreements. And I also think, sometimes I see people who are really caring, who are kind of advocates for all these issues. And they might be like a business owner, say, but they're hypercritical of other business owners who are not supporting. And I always encourage them to tone that down a bit. Nobody is going to engage when they feel attacked. And I think human beings get defensive really easily. And so sometimes the biggest advocates are also maybe doing a little bit of harm. And so I always really believe that if we're going to hold space for people, that has to be for everybody. And often if you can't tell how you're impacted and how it makes you feel, then you're going to be angry. And instead of communicating in a productive way, you're going to be letting out your frustration and anger.
So, and you touched on this at the outset a wee bit, William. Many people in rural areas may face barriers to accessing mental health services. How do you navigate those challenges and ensure individuals receive the support they need?
It's a great question. I have the privilege of being a lived experience outreach worker. And so more often than not, if I'm working with somebody, I can be the bridge. And we do have some really amazing professionals. So sometimes it's as simple as me letting them know how amazing they are, or me being there when they get to meet them. So there's what they call a warm handoff. Initially, it was hard gaining people's trust. But I remember in a small community, one of the beautiful things is when I did gain the trust of our more marginalized folks, when I would meet someone new, they were like, oh, you're that guy who cares and does this and that. And because I'm doing outreach, I'm often building that trust, listening to what the person's going through, and then offering to connect them into services. And when it supports them, offering to ride shotgun. Often when someone's having difficulty engaging with a service, that's also really difficult for the service provider. So having a third party there that's really there for both people, primarily for the client, but really for both. I do it at the hospital here, and it's the hospital finds it super supportive because people who feel stigmatized and feel prejudice and are very traumatized are more likely to get dysregulated and act out, maybe yell. And so trying to create mutual safety has been a really effective way. I'm now a housing outreach worker, and unfortunately, there wasn't a peer support role funded, so that I was never replaced. So I kind of still do a little bit of my old role, because in an under-resourced community, it's really important that we expand a little bit past our roles so that we're holding some of those gaps, right? So that we're catching more people. But I think for people who've had bad experiences, for people who are not coming to get services, the outreach model is beautiful. There are people in Salt Spring trying to work towards getting a mobile health unit, and it would be peer support workers trying to connect them to that mobile health unit. And having an outreach peer support program is one of the goals that the Mental Wellness Initiative is currently pursuing, trying to get funding for.
Well, I love that term you used, the warm handoff, because I think something like that could be so beneficial for folks that are hesitant to take that first step in seeking help, and to have that warm handoff, that introduction. I mean, I can only imagine how absolutely beneficial that is.
Yeah.
So, you know what? We're kind of reaching the end of our 30 minutes here, William. Just one more question for you, or perhaps a comment. What advice or message would you like to impart to individuals who may be struggling with their mental health, and how can they seek support?
It's tough, you know. One of the things I like to say to people who are going through it is that it's about small incremental change. You know, if you're a ship at sea, making a tiny course correction of just a couple degrees over time, that creates a vastly divergent outcome. You're in a totally different place. And another thing I would say, you know, I've had clients who don't want to tell me their trauma because they're worried about impacting me. But serving my clients is one of the biggest things I do for my mental health. You know, in Buddhism, they say when you give the opportunity to give, the person who is giving is the lucky one. They are the one receiving the most. And the greatest gift I think any human being can give the world is having the courage to try to walk on their own path, their own healing journey. And you know, there's no way to predict who will get better. I can never predict a client who will, you know, go into recovery. I had no idea I would be one of the ones who is on this side talking to you like this. I thought, if anything, I'd be just receiving services. And, you know, the other thing I would say is that we love you. You know, the people who have been through it, we are you, and we love you. And by loving you, I've learned how to love myself. And so I'm so grateful to you. You know, it's a tremendous gift. And I think that I totally understand feeling alone in it. But from my perspective, we are very much in this together.
Yeah. Oh, and you know what? You said something there that really impacted me again, William, is when you say the one giving receives the most. I could get into a whole conversation about, you know, oxytocin in our heads and dopamine and all that good stuff. But if we just remember that one statement that you made, the one giving receives the most. It's rewarding when we can help others.
Yeah, the people who do ask for help. They're not an imposition. They're a gift, and it's a small miracle every time it happens, and it just makes the work, the difficult parts of the work, just so much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, William, for joining us today. Your insights into mental health and wellness certainly have resonated with me, as I'm sure they have with our audience. Again, we want everybody to know that it's okay to have challenges, it's okay to be different, and it's okay to need help. If you're struggling today, make sure you reach out and talk about it. Also, please avail yourself of the many resources available in the Rural Mental Wellness Toolkit, which can be found at ruralmentalwellness.com. And I just want to leave you with that thought again for those folks out there that might see this and not necessarily be experiencing a lot of challenges themselves in the mental health area. Please remember that the one giving receives the most. So till next time, stay safe and be well. And thanks again, William.
Thank you, Gerry.